Ladies and gentlemen, seekers of truth and inner balance, there is a peculiar illusion that afflicts the empath, one not easily discerned by the waking mind, and even less so by the heart inflamed with idealized notions of love. The more sensitive the soul, the more porous its boundaries become. What one believes to be compassion, care, and affection may not originate from a pure spring within, but rather be the slow seeping of another's unconscious into one's own psyche, a covert invasion masquerading as intimacy. The empath often walks into the emotional lives of others as if stepping into sacred ground. This is done not out of malice nor even naivety, but from a deep longing to soothe, to mend, to redeem. Yet in this noble drive they become vessels, carriers of what is not theirs. In this process, what they mistake for love may in fact be emotional possession, and possession, though romanticized in poetry and song, is not love. It is colonization of the soul. To be possessed emotionally is to unconsciously allow the contents of another's shadow to intermingle with your own unexamined wounds. Empaths, unaware of their psychic permeability, may absorb the sufferings, longings, and fears of others and interpret them as their own. The chaos of another begins to feel familiar, even necessary. A false sense of identity forms, a union built not on shared self-awareness, but on shared suffering. This is not union, this is enmeshment. The ego calls it love, but the unconscious knows otherwise. The unconscious is not sentimental, it is ancient, vast, and neutral. It does not distinguish between a lover and a parasite. It simply responds to energy, to resonance, to archetypation. And when an empath aligns too closely with the archetype of the healer or the martyr, they unconsciously invite the archetype of the wounded predator into their lives. This dynamic can become addictive. The empath feels needed, the other feels seen, but neither is truly known. Both are trapped in a pattern older than words. In such arrangements, the empath may find themselves exhausted, spiritually depleted, and strangely unable to detach. They will say, "But I love them," without realizing that what they are actually bound to is not the person, but the projection. They are entwined not in affection, but in psychological debt. They carry burdens that do not belong to them. They confuse merging with intimacy and pain with depth. This confusion is the fruit of emotional possession, and yet the call to love is not wrong. It is misdirected. The first love must always be directed inward, not in narcissism but in responsibility. One must love enough to guard the borders of the soul. True love cannot grow where the self has vanished. Boundaries are not walls, but sacred lines of self-respect. Without them, the empath becomes a mirror reflecting someone else's pain, never realizing their own image has faded from view. There are those who will resist this truth, who will say that love requires sacrifice. And indeed it does, but only of what is false, not of the self but of the ego's illusions. Love is not a battlefield. It is not meant to leave you drained, anxious, or perpetually unsettled. If you find yourself drowning in another's emotions, you are not in love, you are possessed. If your sense of identity collapses when they withdraw, you are not in love, you are enmeshed. If you believe their healing is your responsibility, you are not in love, you are trapped in an archetypal role that denies both of your wholeness. The cure is not detachment but integration. To love truly, you must reclaim what was projected. You must bring back your soul's fragments from their grasp. You must look into the mirror and ask, "Who am I when no one needs me?" This question is terrifying to the empath, who has built their identity on being indispensable. But it is essential, for until that question is answered, love remains tainted by unconscious need and disguised possession. We do not love by disappearing into others. We love by standing fully in ourselves and seeing clearly the other who does the same. Anything else is not love. It is fusion, fantasy, and fear. The path of wholeness requires the courage to say, "I feel your pain, but I will not carry it." Only then can love breathe freely, without chains, without masks, without illusions. Only then is the soul safe to open. The empath's love can become a disguise for unconscious emotional possession, leading to identity loss and psychic enmeshment. This happens not in sudden flashes, but in subtle, nearly invisible waves that move beneath the surface of awareness. An empath, by nature, absorbs the emotional states of others like a sponge, believing they are engaging in a noble act of connection. But what begins as attunement can transform into entanglement. Slowly, the empath ceases to differentiate where their feelings end and the others begin. They lose their center, becoming a satellite orbiting around another's wounded gravity. The illusion of love deepens. But what is truly happening is the quiet erosion of selfhood, masked by the language of devotion and care. In many cases, the empath is drawn not to the light in others, but to their pain, They are not attracted to wholeness, but to fractures that mirror their own unconscious wounds. In trying to heal another, the empath is unconsciously attempting to heal themselves. This is not wrong in essence, but when it is unconscious, it becomes dangerous. The empath starts to need the suffering of the other in order to feel valuable. This need is not love, it is possession. It is the silent hope that by becoming indispensable to another's healing, they will become worthy of love themselves. The empath becomes entangled not with the person, but with their brokenness, and their identity fuses with the role of the healer. Over time, the empath may lose all awareness that they are carrying not only their own burdens, but the unprocessed emotions of others. This psychic merger creates an internal chaos that feels like deep connection, but is in fact a collapse of psychic boundaries. Often, what the empath calls love is merely projection. The other becomes a screen onto which the empath casts their fantasies of redemption, belonging, and significance. In this dynamic, the other person may unconsciously exploit the empath's sensitivity, using them as an emotional container. The empath will not notice this exploitation immediately. Instead, they will interpret their growing exhaustion and emotional volatility as signs of love's intensity. The more depleted they become, the more convinced they are that what they feel is real, meaningful, and deep. This is the trap. Emotional possession mimics the depth of love while draining the soul of its substance. The empath, entranced by their own reflection in the suffering of another, does not see that their own identity is fading into obscurity. The unconscious plays a central role in this process. It does not distinguish between love and possession when symbols and archetypes remain unexamined. If the empath has not integrated their inner wounds, they will track those who unconsciously embody these wounds. The relationship becomes a psychic drama, an unconscious ritual in which each plays out their shadow through the other. The empath, convinced of their purity, does not see that they have become emotionally dependent on being needed. This dependence is the glue that binds them to those who are not whole. They believe they are giving love freely, but they are bartering for self-worth. The possession takes hold more firmly when the empath begins to feel guilt at the idea of detaching. They equate separation with betrayal, as if maintaining boundaries is an act of cruelty. In truth, it is the only path to liberation. The cost of this possession is high. The empath begins to lose clarity. Decision-making becomes difficult. Their inner world grows increasingly crowded, filled with voices, moods, and energies that are not entirely their own. Physical symptoms may manifest: fatigue, anxiety, or a sense of heaviness that defies logic. Relationships outside the entangled bond suffer. As the empath becomes consumed by one psychic orbit, they may justify this with phrases like, "They need me," or "I just can't walk away," unaware that these statements betray the depth of their own entrapment. What they call love is in fact psychic fusion. Their soul has become interwoven with another's unresolved suffering, and their identity is now shaped around that entanglement. The archetypal forces at work are not gentle. The wounded healer, the martyr, the redeemer, these are not just poetic metaphors, they are living patterns in the unconscious, and when one becomes identified with them, the line between self and other begins to dissolve. The empath, in assuming the healer's role, unconsciously invites the archetype of the broken one. This dance can last years, sometimes a lifetime. The empath becomes afraid of their own power to detach, afraid of reclaiming their individuality. Because they have mistaken fusion for intimacy, they fear that stepping away will make them cold, heartless, or selfish. But this fear is a lie told by the unconscious to preserve the possession. In truth, stepping away is the beginning of seeing clearly. It is the act of remembering that love does not demand your dissolution. The empath must begin the painful process of self-inquiry. They must ask, what in me is magnetized to pain? Why do I feel safer with someone who is broken than with someone who is whole? What part of me believes I must suffer in order to be loved? These questions are not easy, and their answers are often buried beneath layers of childhood conditioning, ancestral trauma, and forgotten dreams. But without these questions, the empath remains vulnerable to possession. They will continue to enter relationships that drain them, call it love, and wonder why they always feel empty when they give everything. They must learn that love is not proven through suffering, nor is it deepened by merging completely. Love respects the soul. Possession consumes it until the empath recognizes the subtle distinction between compassion and codependence, between empathy and absorption. They will remain at risk. They must become conscious of their gift, not just celebrate it. For even light can blind when it is unexamined. The empath's journey is not only about feeling deeply, but about seeing deeply. seeing the difference between love that honors and love that invades, between care that uplifts and care that entraps, between presence that heals and presence that masks fear of abandonment. Without this discernment, the empath becomes prey to those who unconsciously seek a psychic host. And without boundaries, the empath becomes their unwitting keeper, their emotional host, their mirror, their home, not by force, but by agreement unspoken and unmet within the self, that never learned to say no to pain disguised as love. True love requires strong inner boundaries and the reclamation of the self from archetypal roles of healer or savior. The soul is not built to disappear into another, even in the name of love. In truth, love thrives where two whole beings meet, not where one bleeds into the other. The empath, however, has often been conditioned from early life to confuse love with loss of self. They are taught, subtly or overtly, that to love means to give without limit, to hold the wounds of others without resistance, to heal at the expense of their own well-being. This distortion becomes the blueprint by which they engage in relationships, often unaware that they are reenacting unconscious patterns handed down by family, culture, and collective psyche. The absence of inner boundaries becomes a silent invitation for entanglement. And over time, this erasure of identity in the name of love becomes a prison masquerading as devotion. Boundaries are not walls. They are not defenses. They are sacred lines drawn in the invisible world, declaring what is mine and what is not. They are expressions of self-awareness. Without them, the empath cannot discern where their energy ends and the other's begins. They walk through life absorbing emotional content that does not belong to them. In the presence of someone in pain, they may feel a tidal wave of compassion, but without inner boundaries, this compassion transforms into responsibility. The empath begins to believe they must fix, heal, or rescue. This is not love. This is the adoption of an archetypal role, one that has ancient roots in myth and symbol, but when lived unconsciously, becomes a trap. The healer becomes imprisoned by the very wounds they seek to heal in others. The savior forgets their own humanity in the attempt to redeem another's darkness. The soul cannot survive long in a state of unconscious role-playing. To reclaim oneself means to question deeply the impulse to save others. It means asking why one feels compelled to be the emotional caretaker, the silent protector, the ever-giving source of calm. Often this compulsion originates not from love but from fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, and fear of being unworthy if not needed. These fears live in the shadow and are cloaked in noble intentions. But love rooted in fear cannot nourish. It only depletes. And as the empath continues to give from this unconscious place, their inner vitality begins to shrink. They feel tired not just physically, but existentially. The light they once offered so freely dims, because it was not sustained by wholeness. It was sustained by performance. To reclaim the self is to disrupt the archetypal spell. It is to step back from the unconscious theater and see clearly the mask that has been worn. The empath must look at their own reflection and ask, who am I when I am not needed? Who am I when I am not saving someone? This question strikes at the core of identity. For many empaths have built their sense of worth around being indispensable to others. The role of the healer has become their skin, and removing it feels like a kind of death. But beneath that role is a self untouched by the scripts of suffering, a self waiting to be remembered. A self that knows love does not require sacrifice of truth. In reclaiming this self, the empath must learn to say no, not as an act of rejection, but as an act of self-respect. No to being the emotional container for others' chaos. No to being the silent anchor while others drift in storms of their own making. No to the belief that their love must come at the cost of their own peace. These refusals are not signs of coldness. They are signs of awakening. They are the beginning of a new way of loving, one that honors both self and other, without fusion, without martyrdom. For in truth, love does not need a savior. It needs presence. It needs honesty. It needs two whole people standing side by side, not one dissolving into the other. Archetypal roles are powerful precisely because they offer identity. The healer feels important. The savior feels righteous. But these roles are masks, and over time, they fracture. The soul cannot breathe beneath their weight. When the empath identifies with these roles, they attract those who unconsciously play complementary parts: the wounded, the lost, the dependent. The relationship becomes an unconscious performance where each person is stuck in a pattern older than themselves. Breaking this pattern requires courage. It means disappointing others who have come to rely on the empath's endless giving. It means stepping away from those who refuse to take responsibility for their own healing. It means facing the loneliness that often comes when the old roles are abandoned, and the new self has not yet fully emerged, but within this lonely space is the birth of sovereignty. A self no longer defined by what it gives away, but by what it stands for, a love no longer rooted in fusion, but in clarity. The empath begins to discover that their sensitivity is not a curse, nor merely a gift. It is a call to consciousness, a demand that they learn to wield their compassion with wisdom, that they learn to distinguish between love that liberates and love that binds, that they understand their emotional insight is not a reason to carry others, but a tool for deeper perception and discernment. In reclaiming the self from the archetypal roles, the empath begins to see others more clearly. No longer lost in projection, they can finally meet another soul without merging. They can witness pain without absorbing it. They can offer support without losing ground. This is love at its highest form, love with boundaries, love with awareness, love that neither clings nor controls. It is a love that does not seek to complete the self through another, but that arises from the fullness already present within. This journey toward reclaiming the self is not a quick path. It requires inner work, reflection, and often grief, the grief of letting go of illusions, the grief of realizing how much energy has been spent trying to be enough for others, the grief of stepping out of patterns that once felt safe, but it also brings clarity, peace, and a deeper sense of wholeness. The empath who walks this path learns that love does not demand self-erasure. It invites self-remembering. It calls forth strength, not sacrifice. It thrives not in dependence, but in mutual freedom, and as the empath steps more fully into this awakened love, the roles fall away. The healer becomes human, the savior becomes still, the self becomes sovereign, and in this sovereignty, love can finally breathe undistorted, undemanding, undivided. It is here and only here that love becomes what it was always meant to be, not a rescue, not a performance, but a meeting of souls anchored in their own truth, holding space not to fix or possess, but simply to be fully present, fully known, fully whole.